last week, whenever we gathered, I told you that we had 2 more weeks in Genesis, and I decided to change things up a little bit because I'm going to make it my goal to finish Genesis tonight, which means that we are not going to simply be covering one song, and we're not simply going to be covering 2 songs. We're going to be covering 3 different songs in Genesis tonight, and one of them is the longest song we have gone through so far. And so before we hop into this, I will remind you that we got out 5 minutes early last week. And so if I go late, I'm just borrowing from last week. We're going to be in Genesis chapters 48 and 49 tonight, which you might notice is quite a ways away from where we were at last time. Because last time we were in, Genesis 27, I believe, where we saw, Jacob stealing Esau's birthright and blessing and all that stuff. A lot of chapters have passed since then, and for that reason, we have to talk about a lot of context in order to understand what exactly is going on right here at the end of Genesis. Genesis only has 50 chapters, and so we are at the tail end of this book, and then we will be continuing on in Exodus in the weeks to come. But a lot has happened since Genesis 27. We were following this guy named Jacob, and since then, Jacob's life has transformed dramatically. First off, he's received a new name, right? Jacob, if you remember, it meant heel grabber. Well, he has received another name, which is not necessarily any more positive. He has also received the name Israel, which means God wrestler. And if you want to go read that story, it's in Genesis 32. He actually does wrestle with God. Pretty crazy story. So Jacob's name is changed to Israel, and he went on to marry not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 different women, right? 2 of them were sisters, and 2 of them were the maidservants of the sisters who were given to him because the sisters had a very unhealthy relationship, which typically happens whenever they are married to the same man. But they gave these maidservants to him in an unhealthy competition to have more babies. And so he has these 2 sisters, Rachel and Leah, and then he has these 2 maidservants, Bilhah and Zilhah, who are his 4 wives, and from those 4 wives come 12 different sons and 1 daughter, right? Leah, his first wife, has 6 sons, named Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Zebulun, and Issachar. Rachel's maidservant Bilhah has 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. Leah's maidservant Zilpah has 2 sons, named Gad and Asher. And Rachel, Jacob's favorite wife, at the very end has 2 sons named Joseph and Benjamin. You're not going to be quizzed on those names at the end of the service. But the reason I list that is because those names are going to be very relevant, and you're going to hear them a lot throughout the course of the night. Because these people, born from Jacob's wives, are going to go on to become the 12 patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so these people, very significant. Since Rachel is Jacob's favorite wife, her firstborn son, named Joseph, becomes Jacob's favorite son. And as a result, Jacob's other sons, Joseph's older brothers, they become extremely envious of him over the course of the story, to the point where they end up selling him into slavery in Egypt. So if you think that you and your siblings have a bad relationship, just go read the book of Genesis and you'll realize that you probably have it better than Joseph did. Because as far as I'm aware, I don't think anybody in here has been sold into slavery in Egypt. And if you have, please come tell me that story afterwards, because I want to know how you ended up here tonight. But yeah, so it's a really crazy story, right? Jealousy, envy, all these things. Again, we've emphasized this throughout the weeks. You don't go to Genesis if you're looking for a healthy family dynamic. Chapters 37 to 47 of Genesis detail Joseph's time in Egypt. Though he begins the story as a slave, by the providence of God, he ends up being exalted to second in command of all Egypt. And again, I wish that we had the time to go into that story, because it is genuinely one of my favorite stories in the entire Bible, because it is genuinely just so good. But all you need to know for now is that he started off as a slave, and by the end of the story, he's second in command of all Egypt. And then, when a famine hits the land of Canaan, which if you remember, that's where his family is living, whenever a famine hits the land of Canaan, suddenly Joseph is in the unique position as second in command of Egypt to provide for his family. His brothers come there. At first, they don't know who he is, but eventually he reveals his identity. He forgives his brothers, and he invites them to live with him, right? I'm condensing all these chapters down, but that's ultimately what happens here, so that where we're going to be picking up, where we're at today, is going to be at the tail end of Jacob's life, right? Jacob, again, he's the father of the 12 sons, and all of them have come to live with Joseph in Egypt, and they're all united once again as a big, happy family. With his death approaching, the time comes for Jacob to pass along the birthright and the blessing in the same way that we read back in chapter 27, right? Remember, Isaac was getting old, and he said, okay, I got to pass on the birthright and the blessing, and Jacob stole both of those from Esau. Well, it just so happens that the songs we're covering today comes at a very similar moment in Jacob's life. He is now the old one, and it's time for him to pass on the birthright and the blessing to the future generation. And really the question at the heart of the three songs we're going through tonight is who is going to be the one to receive the birthright and the blessing. And just to remind you what we talked about last week, the birthright, whenever we use that word, we're referring to the physical inheritance, which would typically go to the firstborn son, right? The heir of the family's estate, the firstborn, he would typically receive a double portion of the family's inheritance, right? And so if Jacob has 12 sons, well, one of those sons is going to receive a double portion. Typically, you would expect it to go to the firstborn, but as we've seen throughout Genesis, that's not typically how things go. And spoiler alert, that's going to be consistent today too. The birthright is not going to the firstborn, and we'll talk about why. The blessing, on the other hand, is the spiritual inheritance, right? Birthright, physical inheritance, it's extra money, extra land, extra possessions. The blessing is the spiritual inheritance, which is the passing along of the covenantal promises, right? And to a degree, the blessing is going to be distributed amongst all the 12 sons. They become the 12 tribes of Israel. But the blessing is going to, in particular, follow one son. Because ever since the very beginning of Genesis, remember, we've been tracking the promise of this chosen seed who will one day redeem and restore all things. And the question we're asking as readers is, who is that seed going to come through? And so we're trying to figure out who's going to receive the birthright, who's going to receive the blessing. Last time we gathered, Jacob stole both of those from his brother Esau. And so now, as Jacob nears death, he's going to distribute it the same way, and we want to see if the same level of drama unfolds. Fortunately for us, it's not going to be nearly as dramatic, but there are going to be some interesting dynamics. So we're picking up in chapter 48, and the story is going to pick up with Joseph coming in and visiting his father, and ultimately what Joseph is going to realize and learn in this interaction is that he will be the one to receive the birthright. And like I mentioned earlier, Joseph is not the firstborn son. He was actually the 11th son born to Jacob. Yet what we see right here is that he is going to be the one to inherit the birthright. Though all the sons of Jacob will receive an inheritance, Joseph will be the one to receive the double portion of that. So we pick up Genesis 48, verses 3 through 5. Jacob says to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. And now your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. So ultimately, what Jacob says right here is that he is going to adopt Joseph's two sons as his own. During his time period in Egypt, whenever he was separated from his family, Joseph had two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Manasseh is the older one, Ephraim is the younger one. And Jacob basically calls Joseph in and he says, my firstborns are Reuben and Simeon. But what I'm going to do for you, Joseph, is I'm going to take in your two sons and I'm going to adopt them as my own, and they're going to receive what originally belonged to the first two sons, right? Reuben and Simeon. And so that would be a double portion, basically saying, I'm going to treat your sons like my firstborn and my secondborn. So the question becomes, well, which one of these sons is going to receive the double portion? And this is actually something we see confirmed in 1 Chronicles chapter 5. It says that Reuben was the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's couch, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the sons of Israel. And it says that Reuben defiled his father's couch, and you might say, what is that about? Don't worry, we will talk about that in a second. Long story short, what we see in 1 Chronicles is that it confirms that because Reuben did something really, really bad, he was overlooked when it came to the birthright, and the birthright was instead passed along to Joseph. To me, the question that we should naturally ask to this is why? Why Joseph? Why not any of the other sons? And as best I can tell, there's four main reasons. The first one is something I just highlighted. Reuben did something really, really bad. And again, we'll talk about that in a second whenever Jacob directly talks to Reuben. So first thing, Reuben did something really, really bad that disqualified him from the birthright. Secondly, Joseph did something really, really good. Like I just recapped, he saved his entire family from destruction. And then thirdly, Joseph endured a lot of evil along the way. So not only did he save them from destruction, but his path to saving them incurred a lot of suffering on his own part. And it's actually just a really, really amazing story of redemption and restoration, right? And so Joseph has gone through a lot. He did something really good. He endured a lot of evil. And then fourthly, and this I think actually probably highlights a little bit of Jacob's own personal bias, Joseph is the firstborn son of Rachel. And like I already mentioned, Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife. And what we see throughout the story of Jacob, we haven't really gotten to highlight it because we've kind of skipped a big part of that story, but Jacob is infatuated with Rachel. And throughout his whole story, like Rachel is the one that he just cannot stop being infatuated with, to the point where his first wife, Leah, is actually just neglected by him. And it's actually a really sad story on her part. And so even after Rachel's death, Jacob's favorite sons are Joseph and Benjamin, the two sons that Rachel gave him. And so I think that would be another reason why Jacob ultimately says, Joseph, you're going to be the one to receive the birthright. And this is going to lead us immediately into the first song that we're covering today, which is found in chapter 48, picking up in verse 15. Right? Joseph is bringing his two sons before Jacob. Jacob has now adopted them as his own. And this is what we read. And Jacob blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys. And in them let my name be carried on, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. Right? So the main purpose of this song is to pass the birthright onto these boys. Jacob acknowledges, firstly, how God has supernaturally provided for him all the days of his life. If you know Jacob's story, this is actually pretty surprising because a big part of his story is almost his refusal to acknowledge God along the way. Like I said, his name is changed to God Wrestler, and that's what God himself calls Jacob out on. He says, Jacob, you're constantly striving for yourself. Let me provide for you. Well, right here at the end of Jacob's life, he acknowledges what we've been wanting him to acknowledge. He says, God has provided me all the days of my life, and I pray that he will provide for Ephraim and Manasseh in the same way. He prays ultimately that his name will be carried on through them. And this is actually really significant because 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel will belong to Joseph, the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. You might ask, how does that still add up to 12 though? Because if there's 12 sons and then 2 belong to Joseph, wouldn't that now add up to 13? Well, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But of the 12 tribes, 2 of them will belong to Joseph, which means that Joseph receives the double portion. But then you also have to ask, well, which son is the one who's ultimately being exalted over the other, though? Right? Who is the one truly receiving the birthright of these 2 adopted sons of Jacob now? Well, this is going to lead us into, ultimately, the second song that we're covering. Because as Jacob pronounces this, Joseph notices that Jacob is doing something very, very strange. Right? Joseph brings the boys before Jacob. Jacob is laying down. He reaches out, and whenever he's putting his hands on the boys' heads, he crosses his arms. And he puts his right hand, his dominant hand, atop the head of Ephraim, the younger son, suggesting that the younger son will be exalted over the older son. And this should be something that, again, sounds familiar if you were with us last week, because if you remember, before Jacob was even born, God prophesied to Jacob and Esau's mother in Genesis 25:23, the older shall serve the younger. So Jacob knows this story, right? The older shall serve the younger. But Joseph is really confused by this. Joseph looks, he says, Dad, maybe you're getting old and a little bit blind, but you put your right hand on the wrong kid, right? Manasseh is my older kid, so you need to put your hand over there. Why are you crossing your arms? This is very strange. And Jacob ultimately says, well, no, this is how it's going to be. And the interaction we read here is where our second song is found, right? Genesis chapter 48, picking up in verse 18. Joseph says to Jacob, not this way, my father. Since this one is the firstborn, put your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations. So he blessed them that day, saying, and here's our second song, by you Israel will pronounce blessings, saying, God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. You see the trend, right? Things are constantly, like God's constantly going against the norm, right? Long story short, the younger is again exalted over the older. Just like Jacob was exalted over Esau, so we see that Ephraim is exalted over Manasseh. And it's just kind of ironic because Jacob, he had to steal this for himself, right? Even though God had prophesied it ahead of time. Ephraim doesn't do anything. It just happens, which probably tells us in hindsight that Jacob probably didn't have to swindle it out of Isaac either, right? What God said was going to happen either way. Jacob just decided to do it the hard way and try to trick people into giving it to him. As best I can tell, this song right here is significant for two main reasons, right? This blessing over Ephraim and Manasseh. First off, it emphasizes once again something we've seen throughout Genesis, that God is still going against the culture, right? Like I've already highlighted this week, like I highlighted last week, typically the birthright went to the firstborn. And that's even true in many cultures to this day. Usually the firstborn is the one who receives the greater portion of the inheritance. But God, throughout Genesis, is constantly being countercultural, and he's exalting the younger one over the older one, right? Abel was exalted over Cain. Isaac was exalted over Ishmael. Jacob over Esau. Joseph over his older brothers. And now Ephraim over Manasseh, right? So God is constantly being countercultural. The word that the Bible will typically use to describe this is holy, right? He's being set apart. He's not doing it according to the worldly way. He's doing it according to his own way. The second reason this poem and song is significant is because later on in Israel's history, Ephraim will become very dominant, right? Centuries later, once Israel has a king, once they have a kingdom, and ultimately that kingdom splits into two, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom will ultimately go by the name Judah because that tribe is the dominant tribe in the south, right? It's really only going to be two tribes. It's going to be Judah and Benjamin, but Judah is the bigger tribe, so it goes by the name Judah. The northern kingdom is going to consist of 10 tribes, and in general, they're going to be called Israel, but the name Ephraim will become synonymous for Israel because of how dominant that tribe is, just like Jacob pronounces right here. This is why whenever you get to Hosea chapter 11 and verse 8, God can say, "How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel?" Right? He uses the term synonymously. When he talks about Israel, he says Ephraim. And when he says Ephraim, he means Israel. And that is a direct fulfillment of what Jacob is saying right here. Ephraim will be exalted. Yes, Manasseh will be great, but Ephraim will be very great, to the point that whenever all 10 tribes are lumped together, you can just call them Ephraim, because Ephraim is that much bigger and greater than the rest. And so those are the two main reasons there. And what's actually cool about this song is that to this day, every Sabbath day and Jewish holiday, Jewish people will still bless their sons with the words of the song. They will still pray over their sons, "God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh." So they still look back to this song and they say it's very significant, mainly because Jacob is looking at them and saying these kids are destined for greatness. They're going to prosper and experience abundance. And that's what every parent wants for their kids. And so even to this day, on Shabbat, on the Sabbath day, they call their sons over and they say, "God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh." And so these two songs answer one question: who received the birthright? And the answer to that would be Joseph, right? He receives a double portion, which goes to his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. If you've ever wondered why there is not a tribe of Joseph, it's because there's two tribes of Joseph, right? They're named after his sons, not named after him, right? But we still have another question we have to answer. Who's going to receive the blessing, right? If the birthright goes to Joseph, that's the physical inheritance. Well, who's going to receive the spiritual inheritance, right? It went from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. Who does it go to next? And this is going to lead us to the third song that we're covering today, which is in chapter 49, which if you look at it, you'll notice is the longest song we've had in the entire book of Genesis. It is pretty much the entire chapter. And what we're going to see in this song is that Jacob is going to call all 12 of his sons in, and he is going to speak to every single one of them, and he is going to tell them what awaits them in the future. And I'm just going to tell you right off the bat, some of these are so vague that I can't give you a definitive answer on what exactly is meant by this. And if you go read a commentary on it, you will, one commentary will give you 5 different possibilities. But some of them we can look at, and we have a very good idea of what exactly Jacob is saying, which is really cool. And the cool thing beyond that is that we see on one hand, the blessing is distributed to all the sons, but there is one son, and actually two sons, who are going to receive a special portion of that blessing. And so, we pick up Genesis chapter 49, verses 1 and 2. Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you what shall happen to you in days to come. Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob. Listen to Israel, your father." So like I mentioned, Jacob calls his sons together here to tell them what's happening. And what we see here, I think I've got the ESV translation up there. It says, "in days to come." But the Hebrew phrase here is more accurately translated as "the last days." Right? That's what the phrase literally translates to. I will tell you what is going to happen in the last days. And so he's not simply looking at what is going to happen to them in the days and weeks and months to come. He is looking at the tribe's total history as a whole. From the beginning of the story, he's pointing to the end. And this is a phrase that actually only shows up a few times in the Old Testament. We see that phrase showing up a lot more in the New Testament where it talks about the end times. But this phrase just shows up a few key places in the Old Testament, and some of the most significant times is these pronouncements over the 12 tribes, right? So while he does say words to every single one of the sons, there are two sons in particular who are going to stand out. One of them, as might be expected, is Joseph. The other one, who might be a little bit more unexpected, unless you've been reading the story of Genesis very, very closely, is a guy named Judah. The rest of the sons, we'll talk about them a little bit, but we're mainly going to focus on Judah and Joseph because those are really the main points of the song. And so he begins by talking to the sons of Leah, his first wife. If you actually compare the song to the order that the kids were born in, it doesn't follow in the order of birth order. It follows in the order of who they were born to, right? Because technically, Leah's sons, she had 4 sons, and then some of the maidservants started having some kids, and then it went back to Leah, and then it went over to Rachel. But whenever you look at the song here, it just goes through all of Leah's sons, then it goes through all of the maidservants or the concubines' sons, and then it goes to Rachel at the very end, right? So it's doing it according to their mother, not according to birth order, in case you were wondering. So he starts with the sons of Leah, wherein there's 6 of them, and this is what he says to Reuben, verses 3 and 4. "Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch." The first half sounds really good. I feel kind of bad for Reuben here, right? Reuben stands there. He's the first one Jacob talks to. He says, "Reuben, my firstborn, my pride and joy, the one who rightfully should receive everything. You're not getting anything because I know what you did." Like, poor Reuben, right? He's like, oh, this is not good news for him. As firstborn, Reuben would be the natural recipient of both the birthright and the blessing, right? He's the firstborn. But if you go back to Genesis chapter 35, verse 22, there's one verse that tells us what disqualified Reuben. It says that while Israel, which is Jacob, while he lived near the region of Bethlehem, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Translation, Reuben slept with his stepmom and was understandably disqualified from both the birthright and the blessing whenever his dad found out. And so, rather than being promised the right of the firstborn, all he's promised is instability, right? He says, "Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence," right? You might have spent all this time thinking that's what you were going to get, but no, I know what you did, and you're just going to be unstable all your life. All right, so we naturally move to the second and third born, Simeon and Levi. And this is what we read here, verses 5 through 7. "Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and the wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." Well, yikes, that doesn't sound much better. And you look at this, and right off the bat, you should notice there's something off, because he doesn't address the sons individually. All the other sons are addressed individually, but for some reason he addresses these sons together, and I imagine that the very moment he said Simeon and Levi together, they knew what they were about to hear. Because as second and third born, Simeon and Levi might have naturally been expected to be next in line to receive the inheritance, but whenever he mentions them together, there's a certain story that would have come to mind to them and also to us as readers, because there's one thing that happened in chapter 34 that disqualified Simeon and Levi as well. Back in chapter 34, remember how I mentioned that Jacob also had a daughter? I haven't mentioned her so far, right? There were 12 sons, but he also had a daughter born to him by Leah, and her name was Dinah. And in chapter 34, Jacob's daughter Dinah was assaulted by a man in a neighboring village. The man's name was Shechem. And ultimately, in a big plot twist of the story, the man ends up being filled with this intense remorse, and he actually convinces his entire community to partake in the covenant of circumcision in an attempt to make peace with Jacob's family. To where, by the end of the story, if you can believe it or not, this guy ends up being the guy you feel bad for. The story starts off with him assaulting a woman. But by the end of the story, you feel bad for him because he feels remorse. He wants to make amends. He goes to the family. He says, what do I need to do to make things right? And they say, well, we are God-fearers, and we have this covenant with God about circumcision. So if you and all the men in your city get circumcised, then we can freely marry and we will be good to go. And so he convinces everybody to go and do it, right? He says, guys, I really want to be friends with these people, so we're going to get circumcised. I imagine the other guys in the city were not too thrilled by that news, but they did it. And then in Genesis 34:25, this is what we read. On the third day after they were circumcised, on the third day when they were sore, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came against the city while it felt secure and killed all the males. So Simeon and Levi took advantage of this situation, right? These guys were sore because they just went through quite the ordeal. They were circumcised as adults. They're out for several days. And in the midst of this, Simeon and Levi have an idea. They say, what if we sneak in, take advantage of their weakness, and we murder them? They can't even defend themselves. As a result of this, in verse 30, this is what Jacob says to Simeon and Levi. He says, you have brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of the land. Jacob is furious. Keep in mind what the purpose of Israel is to be. They're supposed to be a light to the nations, right? If people sin against you, you're supposed to forgive them. You're not supposed to murder them in cold blood in a state of weakness. And so he says, you haven't made my name a pleasing aroma to people. You've made it a stench. When people think of me, they're going to be disgusted because of what you've done. And so they're disqualified as well. And that is exactly what Jacob promises them right here. He says that they will be divided. And sure enough, whenever you look at how the land is going to be allotted to the different tribes once they get into the promised land, Simeon's allotment of land is going to be in the midst of Judah's, right? Judah's going to have this big territory, and then Simeon is going to be in the very midst of it, surrounded on all sides. So he's going to be separated from everybody else with Judah surrounding him. Levi, it gets even more interesting. The name Levi itself means to be joined or attached to something, which makes it really ironic whenever Jacob says you're going to be divided. So he's going to be the opposite of his name. Rather than being joined, you're going to be separated. And what's going to be interesting about this is that Levi is going to go on to become the priestly tribe. So rather than inheriting any land, the priests are going to be scattered into all the tribal territories. They're going to receive cities where they're going to minister from, but they're not going to receive one piece of the land like the other tribes are going to receive. And this actually explains why we don't refer to 13 tribes of Israel, right? There's 12 sons. Jacob receives a double portion, which adds up to 13, but Levi doesn't receive an allotment of land, right? Levi is the priestly tribe scattered throughout everywhere, so that's why we typically refer to the 12 tribes of Israel, if that makes sense. So there's 11 of the sons receive stuff, and then you can do the math. All right, so that explains that. And so Levi is going to be separated. But we don't exactly see that explained right there. We just see they're going to be divided. And as you continue reading the story, once you get into Exodus, you see why Levi becomes the priestly tribe. Which then leads us to Judah. Like I mentioned at the beginning, Judah is where things get really exciting because we've passed by Reuben, we've passed by Simeon and Levi, and if you've been reading Genesis at the beginning of Judah's story, you would think that he'd be disqualified too. But if you've read to the end of Judah's story, you probably already know where this blessing is going to be going. This is what Jacob says to Judah, picking up in verse 8. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Binding his foal to the vine and donkey's colt to the choice vine, he has washed his garments in wine and his vesture in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth are whiter than milk. You notice how Jacob just has a lot more to say to Judah than all the rest? So that right off the bat should be like, hey, this is really important, right? But you'll also notice when you look at what Jacob says, it's a lot more positive. And ultimately what we see is that Judah is going to be the one who receives the covenantal blessing, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah. The big question becomes why? And like I mentioned, if you've been reading through Genesis, and again, we didn't go through these chapters ourselves, but throughout the midst of the Joseph story, there's a second story taking place. And that's the story of Judah. And Judah's story starts off horribly. It starts off really, really bad. In fact, Judah was the son who proposed selling Joseph into slavery. Originally, they were just going to kill him, and Judah says, hey, hold up. Rather than killing him, we can make a buck off of this. Let's sell him into slavery so that we don't have to deal with the guilt of killing our brother, and we can make some profit out of this. That's already a strike against Judah. And then when you get to chapter 38, it gets even worse. He impregnates his son's widow after mistaking her for a prostitute and cheating her off of a lot of other things, right? The story's a lot longer than that. But all you have to hear is that part to realize, oh, wow, this guy does not sound like a great person, right? When you look at chapters 37 and 38, you think Judah is a lost cause. He is a terrible person. But at the very end of chapter 38, this woman that he has impregnated, her name is Tamar, she confronts him over his sin, and he ends up realizing she is more righteous than I am. Because she played a big part in the story as well. Everything she did wasn't necessarily great either, but he points out that she is more righteous than I. And obviously Judah didn't know who Jesus was at the time, but that's his come to Jesus moment. He realizes, I am a terrible person who is heading down a terrible and destructive path, and by the time we meet Judah again later on in the story of Genesis, he's a radically transformed person. Because by the end of the story, whenever Jacob's family and the sons, they go to Joseph and they're begging for food, Judah ends up sacrificially offering himself in place of his youngest brother, Benjamin, who was his dad's new favorite son, even though at the time he thought that Benjamin was guilty of stealing something from a government official who turned out to be his brother. Long story short, what I'm saying is this. Judah thought that Benjamin was guilty of doing something very, very, very bad. And formerly, Judah is the one who had suggested, hey, let's sell dad's favorite son into slavery. But by the time you get to the end of Judah's story, he says, I don't want to cause my father any pain. So instead, I want you to let my guilty brother go free, and I want you to take me instead. So Judah, though he was innocent in this moment, he offers himself in place of somebody he believes to be guilty. Does that sound familiar? It sounds a little bit like Jesus, doesn't it? So Judah's story begins looking a lot like the serpent. But by the end of Judah's story, he looks a lot more like Jesus. It's a story of redemption. And so whenever Jacob turns to Judah here, he promises a blessing. The name Judah means praise, and so quite fittingly, Jacob says, your brothers shall praise you. The Hebrew word is yada, right? Yehuda, your brother shall yada you. They will praise you. And ultimately what we see, both in this poem and also throughout history, is that the Redeemer that is promised to humanity will come from Judah's line. And so quite literally, his brothers will praise him. They will praise Christ. Judah is pictured here like a lion who is a protector and leader of his family. And ultimately, he is promised that there is going to be this ruler who comes from him. Like we were singing earlier, this ruler is going to be known by the title, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, right? If Judah is a lion who leads his brethren, well, the leader who comes from Judah is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And Jacob alludes to this leader in the following verse, using royal imagery. he promises that the scepter belongs to Judah. What is a scepter? It's something that a king holds. But Israel's not even a nation yet. They don't even have a king. But Jacob, again, he's looking to their entire history. And he says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. Judah will be the leading tribe of the 12 tribes. And you actually see this playing out. Whenever you go into Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Judah is at the front lines. They are the ones leading people into action. They are the leaders. But then Jacob says something interesting. It says that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. If you look at other translations, they will say, until Shiloh comes. And that is actually probably a preferable translation. The word Shiloh simply means he whose it is. So if you look at the NIV, the New International Version, it translates the verse like this. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. Right? And so what Jacob says to Judah is he says, you are going to be the leading tribe amongst your brethren. And you will have that ruler's staff. You will be the kingly tribe, the royal tribe to all of them, until from Judah comes a king. And that king will not only rule over his brethren, but the obedience of the nations will belong to him. You can see right here how this is like the beginning of, the idea of the Messiah, right? From Genesis chapter 3, there was this idea of the seed of the woman to be born to crush the serpent. And then we knew that that seed was going to be born from Abraham, from Isaac, from Jacob. Well, right here in these verses, it's confirmed to us that he'll be born from Judah. And this is something that the Jewish people recognize, right? That's why whenever you get to the Gospel of Matthew, the first thing that Matthew starts off with is a genealogy. Because if Jesus does not have the right genealogy, he doesn't qualify to be the Messiah. So he says, Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers, right? And then he goes all the way down to Jesus, because if Jesus doesn't meet those criteria, he does not qualify. And so ultimately, Jacob is saying that the Messiah will come from the line of Judah, and all peoples, not just Israel, shall obey him. The obedience of the nations belongs to him. That's really cool. But then he moves on. He goes on to Zebulun and Issachar, verses 13 through 15. Zebulun shall dwell at the shore of the sea. He shall become a haven for ships, and his border shall be at Sidon. Issachar is a strong donkey, crouching between the sheepfolds. He saw that a resting place was good, and that the land was pleasant, so he bowed his shoulder to bear and became a servant at forced labor. For some of these, I'm going to start moving a little bit quicker because, again, we don't know as much about these tribes, and we don't have as much to work with, and I'm also trying to be mindful of your time. So Zebulun here, he's told that he is going to thrive through trade and dwell near the sea, right? You will dwell at the shore of the sea. He shall become a haven for ships. If you actually look at the map of the tribal allotments, you'll notice that Zebulun actually doesn't sit on the coast. It doesn't touch the Mediterranean Sea or the Sea of Galilee, but it does dwell right in the middle of those, right? And that's actually probably an ideal place for trade and an ideal place for sea travel, right? Because you're going to have people who are crossing this way, you have people who are crossing through, and so that would be the ideal place for something like that to take place. Issachar, meanwhile, he's compared to a donkey. And the implication here would seem to be that he's going to dwell in good land, but it's going to come at a cost. And he's going to serve people like a beast of burden, right? You're a strong donkey crouching between the sheepfolds. He saw that a resting place was good and that the land was pleasant, so he bowed his shoulder, right? So as best we can tell, it's saying that Issachar is going to willfully choose to serve in exchange for good land. I don't have much to say beyond that. And so those are the 6 sons of Leah. And from there, Jacob turns and he addresses the sons of the maidservants: Dan, Gad, Asher, and Naphtali. Verses 16 through 18. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heels so that his rider falls backward. I wait for your salvation, O Lord. So this is another one where you just read it and you realize that does not sound very positive. It actually sounds quite negative. It starts off with him saying, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. And that is another pun because the name Dan means to judge. So it says, Dan shall Dan his people. He shall live true to his name. But then you ask, well, how is he going to judge his people? We do know that some of the judges in the book of Judges are going to come from the tribe of Dan. But I think it's going even deeper than that. right? Because it says, he shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heels. Uh-oh. We have mention of a serpent and biting heels. Well, what does that sound like? That sounds like Genesis chapter 3, right? Where we talked about, there's the seed of the woman, seed of the serpent, and the serpent is going to bite the heel. It doesn't sound like the tribe of Dan is going to produce a lot of positive things, does it? And sure enough, whenever you look at Dan's history, ultimately they will be tricksters like Jacob, and they will be deceivers like the serpent. In the book of Judges, Dan is going to be the tribe that introduces idolatry into the land of Israel. And then, if you fast forward to the book of Kings, King Jeroboam in the northern kingdom, he will set up one of his golden calves in the city of Dan, right? And so whenever you just look at Dan's history, it doesn't look so good. When you get to the book of Revelation and you actually have the 12 tribes being listed out, Dan isn't even mentioned in that list, which is interesting. I don't have an answer for that. I just wanted to highlight it so you can go check it out for yourself. Moving on to verse 19. Raiders shall raid Gad, but he shall raid at their heels. Ultimately, what Gad is being told here is that he will struggle for a little while, yet he'll experience triumph in the end, right? People are going to raid you, but you're going to raid them right back and you'll get the last laugh. I don't have much to say beyond that, other than the fact that my favorite part about that entire verse is that this is a quadruple pun, right? Because in Hebrew, I'm going to butcher this, but this is what it sounds like. In Hebrew, when you read the verse, it says, Gad, Gedud, Yegudenu, Ha-Yagud, Akef. It's like God. Like all of it is just a pun. The word God, like that's his name. And then Gedud means a band of raiders. And then Gud is the verb, right, which means to raid. And so Gad is going to be gadded and he's going to gad. It's just really funny. I don't have much to say beyond that. I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to that stuff, and I had to highlight it because I just find it really entertaining. He doesn't do that with all the other names, but for some reason when it comes to Gad, it's like he just really wanted to say a pun 4 times. Verses 20 and 21, Asher and Naphtali. Asher's food shall be rich, and he shall yield royal delicacies. Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns. The first one of these is pretty easy to interpret. The second one, your guess is really as good as mine. Asher, the name simply means happy, right? He says, Asher's food shall be rich, and he shall yield royal delicacies. The idea is that Asher is going to experience the truth of his name. He will have a happy life. His history of his tribe will be good, right? He is told that he will enjoy prosperity and produce luxury food, right? Good things are going to come from the tribe of Asher. That's a good thing to hear. As for Naphtali, there is huge debate over what exactly this means. It says, Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns. But if you were to compare this to some other translations, it actually says something entirely different. It says, Naphtali is a doe let loose who gives beautiful words. I don't fully know, and honestly, the Bible doesn't really talk about the tribe of Naphtali that much, to where it doesn't really help, it doesn't give us anything really to interpret that through, but I can tell you that God knows the answer. Some people think that what this is really saying is that it speaks of a free people who are going to be eloquent in speech, right? A doe let loose, they're free, they're bounding over the hills, but then they give beautiful words, so they're wise. I honestly do not know, and I'm totally fine with admitting I don't know. Because now we get to go to the sons of Rachel. And what you'll notice right off the bat is that Joseph is another long one, right? He spoke a long time to Judah, and he's going to talk a long time to Joseph. And like I mentioned at the very beginning, these are the 2 people who are going to be emphasized the most, right? So we already saw Judah's blessing, and interestingly enough, he's going to give a pretty good blessing to Joseph as well. Joseph is a fruitful bow by a spring. His branches run over the wall. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely. Yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. By the God of your father who will help you, by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb. The blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of the parents, up to the bounties of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph and on the brow of him who was set apart from his brothers. And then he just gives one verse about Benjamin at the very end. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, and at evening dividing the spoil. Again, I feel kind of bad for Benjamin. So Joseph here, he is promised that he will be abundantly fruitful despite opposition, and he will be blessed overall. Right? And what we actually see in those verses right there just to condense it all down, is that Jacob actually recounts Joseph's story in poem form, right? He points out that in Joseph's past, he was attacked and he was harassed on all sides, yet he faithfully and unflinchingly stayed true to God, right? Throughout all of it. And he was preserved by God through all of that, and therefore, as a result, he will receive blessings upon blessings, right? This is why he receives 2 tribes. This is why his tribes will be blessed. It's because Joseph was very, very faithful, right? And God graciously is going to bless him even more. There is an interesting part I want to highlight there, and I do realize it's almost 7:30. Believe me, I'm almost getting through this. I told you I ended 5 minutes early last time. So there's an interesting thing in here. When referring to the mighty one of Jacob, Jacob says, "From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel." And there's a lot of debate that people have over what that is referring to. Is Jacob referring to God as the shepherd and the stone of Israel, or is this another reference to the Messiah, right? Because it could go either way, especially whenever you look later on into the Old Testament and you try to figure out, like those are terms that are kind of used interchangeably about both of them. And later scriptures would clearly identify Yahweh, God, as the shepherd and the stone, right? Those titles are more often used of God than of the Messiah. However, there are some Jewish people, and this is actually really interesting to me, there are some Jewish people who developed the notion that there were going to be not one, but 2 Messiahs. And don't worry, I'm not about to start a cult. This is heading somewhere. There are some Jewish people who believe that there were going to be not one, but 2 Messiahs. One of them they call Messiah ben David, Messiah son of David, and the other one they call Messiah ben Joseph, Messiah son of Joseph. And according to this belief, the Messiah son of Joseph is a servant who, like Joseph, suffers righteously on behalf of the people, even unto death possibly, in order to pave the way for redemption. Not all Jewish people believe this, but there are some who did hold to this even prior to the time of Christ. And then Messiah, son of David, that's typically who we think of whenever we think of the Messiah, right? This is the one from the tribe of Judah, a victorious king who, in this line of thought, follows Messiah ben Joseph, resurrects him, and ultimately brings redemption and peace. And both of those need to be fleshed out a little bit, and you could go into deep theologies on both of them, and there's plenty of books written about this. But what I love about this kind of fringe Jewish theory is that as Christians, we can actually affirm both things to be true. On one hand, the terms shepherd and stone of Israel is reference to both God and the Messiah, because as Christians, we believe that the Messiah was God in the flesh. And therefore, is it referring to God or the Messiah? Yes, both. On the other hand, Jesus actually fulfills both roles of Messiah, son of Joseph, and Messiah, son of David. He was not a literal descendant of Joseph, but like Joseph, he did suffer at the hands of wicked men, and he offered himself for the salvation of others. And then, like the messianic expectation they held to, one day he will return to rule and reign forever. And so what's cool is that as Christians, we actually would say, he actually fulfills both roles. And so we would say, you thought it was 2 separate messiahs, but it was actually the same Messiah who was showing up at 2 different times. I just find that kind of cool. And so ultimately, Joseph is promised these amazing blessings. And then when you get to Benjamin, poor Benjamin, he's compared to a fierce wolf who will be known for being especially cruel. And this is true whenever you actually look throughout the history of the Old Testament. We see this at the end of the book of Judges, right? Benjamin is going to be very bad. And then the first king of Israel is going to be this guy named Saul, who's going to be a little bit more of a tyrant. And where does he come from? The tribe of Benjamin. Also, the Apostle Paul, who started off as basically a persecutor of the church, also from the tribe of Benjamin. And so there are those 3 songs. The way I want to end is going to be very brief because I know we want to get out of here, is 3 key takeaways from these songs, right? I know we covered a whole lot today. It's kind of like drinking from a fire hydrant. But I wanted to cover all 3 of these together because they all tie together, right? They're about the 12 tribes of Israel. It made sense to tie them to address them together. And the 3 takeaways that I want to highlight from this. Firstly, God knows your end from the beginning, right? He knows where your story is going to end even before it has started. What we see in all 3 of these songs is that God saw Israel's entire history as a nation, even whenever they were but 12 sons standing in the tent of their father. Even as the book of Genesis reaches its end, God knows how he's going to wrap up Revelation. That's pretty cool. Though man, us, though we are forced to live in the present, God ultimately knows all things. And this should both comfort us and sober us up, right? It should comfort us because we don't know the end of our story, but God does. And it should sober us up because we don't know the end of our story, but God does. And therefore, we should make sure that we are living rightly before him. Second takeaway, God has a plan, right? These aren't profound takeaways, but this is an important takeaway. As the story of Scripture progresses, things are going to get so hectic in the story that on occasion it will seem like there is no hope for Israel or for God's people as a whole. Yet, poems like this remind us that amidst the chaos, God does have a plan, and even whenever we can't see it, he does. And the same is true in our lives, right? Not every single one of us has received a really cool poem that tells us how the story is going to end, but we do serve the same God who could just as easily give us a poem like this if he wanted to, right? And so God has a plan, and if we don't understand that plan, that's okay. We're not called to understand the plan, we're called to live by faith. Third and final takeaway, it's not about how you start, it's about how you finish. This last takeaway is chiefly focused on Judah. One could argue that redemption stories are God's favorite types of stories. Judah is the perfect example in the book of Genesis because he starts off as a picture-perfect image of the serpent, yet by the end of the story, he offers us a glimpse of the gospel and ultimately is promised that the Christ will come from his line. Had a rough start, but heck of a finish, right? That's cool. And so, like any race that people run, it's not about how you start, it's about how you finish. And our job is to finish well, right? And that should hopefully encourage all of us, because if God can work with people like Jacob and Judah, he can work with every single one of us. It's simply a matter of how we respond to him. Amen? All right. Well, I finished 5 minutes early last time. I've gone 5 minutes over today, and so I think I should pray for us so I don't go into debt. Lord, we thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. We thank you for your word. We thank you for knowing the end from the beginning and having a plan, God. And I pray that as we depart from here today, ultimately we will trust in that plan and we will live for you these few fleeting days of our lives. Help us make the most of them, God, and help us live for you and love others as you would have us love. We love you, God, and we praise you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.